has a long background in juvenile justice and juvenile sex offender work, as well as adult sex offenders. He worked as a juvenile probation officer, as well as a therapist in private practice, notably in the Chicago area, where he was instrumental in helping Illinois craft their response to juvenile offenders. He's been on the faculty of several universities as both an adjunct and an assistant professor, the University of Washington, Loyola University, Illinois University, the Medical College of Virginia, and the University of Virginia. At the present time, he is the director of the Office of Sexually Violent Predator Services for the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. In addition, he's worked as a consultant both in the U.S. and abroad to really refine the response to juvenile sex offenders, and particularly predatory juveniles and adult sex offenders. So with that, I welcome Steve, and we will consider today's topics. We'll start with a general overview and perhaps define some of the terms that we're using. Really look at the characteristics of Florida's population and then some national trends. Have some discussion around recidivism and what we know about that in this emerging field of practice. Have a look at psychosexual evaluations, and within that really have a discussion about the perspective of risk as it might be defined with this population, to look at some of the treatment issues for youth with problem sexual behaviors as well as their families, to really look at the elements of your role as a juvenile probation officer, and to consider case management as a general topic, and then more specifically the issues of responses around non-compliant or non-compliance behaviors. So with that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Wolf.
Good morning, or good afternoon. Sorry about that, wrong time zone. I want to start with an apology. The weather here has turned foul, and that always affects my sinuses, and so I've got coffee and throat lozenges, and I'm going to armor myself through this presentation with that. Let's start with just a quick consideration of what is normal and healthy sexuality and what is abusive sexuality. On the screen you have some quick definitions or descriptive definitions to differentiate the two. I think it's important for us to always remember that sex is absolutely part of our hardwiring as a species. We are instinctively inclined to be sexual. But how that occurs is infinitely variable. Social learning and social instruction in families and in our communities and on television and other media provide us with model pathways showing us how to become sexual with each other. I guess as we are shown, we become.
So we wanted to discuss what some of the characteristics are of juvenile sex offenders or juveniles with problem sexual behaviors. Our language really moves all over the place, so you may see language like sexually reactive, and that is typically applied to children under the age of 12. You may see other terminology like sexual aggression or sexual offenders, but we've tried to settle, and I think the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice has really chosen the term wisely of problem sexual behaviors. but you will see us moving from within the language that is reflected in the literature to perhaps using sex offender language as it seems appropriate throughout this presentation. There are some characteristics of juveniles that juveniles with problem sexual behaviors that we think are important to review with you. The data on this is still emerging, and Florida is participating in a national project that is involving 5 states with the Urban Institute to really look at some of the characteristics of juvenile sex offenders or our juveniles with problem sexual behaviors. And so I expect that once that work is completed, we will know more than we know today. But based on what we know today from national trends, many of our youth with problem sexual behaviors or sex crime charges have no prior criminal history. And you would say, well, that's also true with delinquent populations, and we would agree with you. However, these behaviors are starting at a, if you will, a different point in the continuum than perhaps our first offenders are in the juvenile justice system and general delinquencies. The next piece is a really important piece, and I'm sure you know it from your practice, and that is that victims are generally known to the offenders. They may be family members or relatives or acquaintances. And some of the research that has been done on this, and I must tell you that it's very limited at this point, but have identified that about 60% of the offenses actually take place in the home, and another around 30% take place in school settings. Now, depending on your school surveillance or school policing practices, that may differ from state to state and place to place, so that's not a Florida-specific data. The next is that juveniles differ from adult sex offenders, and that as this field emerges, we are learning more and more. I think all of us are aware now of the brain maturational work that is taking place in our field to really understand that juveniles' brains are highly dynamic or plastic at the ages in which we encounter them. However, it's also important to note that these children are also physically maturing into sexuality, meaning their endocrine or hormone systems are in flux. And there's some interesting research coming out in that area as well in terms of findings around how these variables are in place. But we also know that the behavioral patterns between juvenile sex offenders or youth that have sex crime charges differ from adults that have sex crime charges. And one is that we've already noted the issue of that the victims are known to juvenile offenders. But other aspects of it would suggest that the behaviors of juvenile sex offenders are subject to change. There are fewer pedophiles, meaning persons that pursue victims that are children, or in some state laws, who are 4 or more years younger than the person initiating the sex crime or sex offense behaviors. Sexual reoffense rates or recidivism tend to be very low, and the national research seems to be focused on a figure of about 7%, but the studies have run 4 to 14% as noted there. Another difference between juveniles and adults is that juveniles are highly amenable to treatment, and not only treatment themselves, but treatment within their family systems. And this presence of families as a critical variable in treatment and in supervision or compliance is an important one and theme that we're going to follow throughout today's webinar. Finally, juveniles have fewer antisocial peers, and they have I'm sorry, because I'm just looking at this and reading it wrong, but fewer antisocial peers are less likely, are more likely, I'm sorry, to commit juvenile sex offenders in groups than adult sex offenders, and they are less likely to have other charges that are non-sexual charges associated with the sex offense in question. The next piece is some data that was developed from Florida's demographic data, and you will see that 92% of the persons that are coming as referrals to DJJ on a sex crime or sex charge are male. So we have few females, and when compared to your general population, 71% is male. This figure is very consistent with what we see nationally. The next two figures are somewhat different than what we see nationally, in that 24% of your referrals are under the age of 14 and 58% under the age of 16. And so what this means to me is, one, you are seeing a younger population than what we have seen nationwide reported. The involvement of families or family members and the issue in terms of where these youth reside following treatment are particularly critical variables to consider. From the PAC data, we also found some surprises, and the first is around history of sexual abuse. And you can see that figure in your general delinquency population of referrals is 3.6%, and with youth with sex crimes, it's 10%. So substantially more youth who are in your in this population have had a history of sex abuse according to the PACT. And these data are at referral, and we know that as you move through the process that you may have more disclosure of a history of sex abuse as you work with these youth, particularly in clinical settings. The next is history of violence or abuse, child abuse, and again you see almost double the rate that was observed in the general delinquency population. And the final is on a history of depression, and again significantly more depression and anxiety and mood disorders than what we see in your general population. In all of these data, as they were reported, they are substantially lower than what we see in the national data, in that on a history of sex abuse, the tendency of the data is to identify about a third of the population have a history of sex abuse or reported sex abuse, documented sex abuse in the records. That in terms of depression and anxiety and mood disorders, the figures are almost double what you're seeing in Florida, around 60%. And there can be a lot of reasons why this is happening, and we're not in a position to be anything but speculative about it. But I think it was hopefully helpful to you to see that data, and I thank Catherine Gomez and the team in the research division that put this data together for us.
Okay, let's start with a question of how and why some people as children and youth, juveniles become folks with problems of sexual aggression. There are a number of speculative pathways for how this occurs, but there's no single cause that we know of. There's, again, no single adequate explanation for sexual aggression. And I think when we look, and this is all part of the answer to the question, how are children different than adults? Because of different rates of brain maturation and degrees of brain maturation, children are prepared, meaning buffered against certain experiences that might cause them problems, as well as susceptible to experiences that might cause them problems. One of the factors that is reported in literature, but more research needs to be done, is that children who have been sexually abused, who have at least one healthy relationship with an appropriate adult, seem to be more resilient to being sexually abused than children who are more emotionally isolated and unbonded with other people. And their behavior is constantly evolving. When you look at an adult sex offender, someone in their 30s, 40s, 50s, what you see is a pretty stable pattern. It's not changing very quickly. It's not changing very much at all. When you look at children and youth, what you see is behavior patterns that are evolving almost daily. They're evolving and maturing at a much greater rate than their adult counterparts. Because the behavior is constantly evolving, we have to assume that what we're seeing right now isn't where the behavior started, and it may or may not be where it's going. But the important thing is to consider looking for a pattern of sexual aggression. And we'll get back to this during the psychosexual evaluation piece, but when I'm doing an evaluation, I'm looking at everything that's going on at the moment of that offense, including the time of day, the location, the clothing worn. All of those kinds of things can play a role. This allows us to make some reasonably educated guesses about etiology, past action, and possible future actions. And these guesses serve as guides for future exploration. Delinquent history. And I'm just going to touch this very briefly because we'll come back to it. But offenders or sexually aggressive children and youth who offend against younger children are more often emotionally inadequate or emotionally immature, even for their age, socially inadequate, and suffer from a variety of other social deficits, including, and I'll keep coming back to this theme because I think it's important and critical to our understanding the behavior of these kids, and that is that they don't develop really good emotional, intimate connections with other people. One characteristic for me that defines this field to a great degree is that they are disconnected from other folks. Older kids are inclined to commit sex offenses against peers and against adults. What we see in this group is more clear evidence of conduct disorders, antisocial thinking, and the beginnings of criminal versatility. This breaks down into three useful constructs: antisocial personality characteristics. And the issue of psychopathy in children is controversial. It's pretty clear that older kids can be psychopathic, but at what age do you begin to seriously consider the existence of that pattern? When does a sexually reactive kid become a sexually predatory kid? The second is paraphilic sexual interests, or interests in sexual behavior that is exploitive, manipulative, or aggressive. and attitudes and beliefs that support offending. I want to stay on this a little bit. A researcher named David Finkelhor back in the 1980s proposed 4 preconditions to sexual offending. The first was that the idea had to be congruent with the individual, meaning that if you think about jamming a pencil in your eye, that's incongruent. You're not going to do it. There have to be other factors that are going to make that seem like a reasonable idea. Same would be true of sex offending. The second is that the actor has to overcome their internal inhibitions against it. They have to think that they can do it and get away with it, that they're not going to get hurt or be harmed by it. The third is overcoming the external inhibitions. When we think about sexual aggression, sexual abuse, that means finding a physical location where they know they're not going to be caught, they're not going to be stopped. And 4, overcoming victim resistance, either by manipulation, seduction, trickery, coercion, or force. Well, prediction. That's always the elephant in the room. And it works.
Can you change the slides, please? Can you? I don't know if you're on a different slide.
No, same slide.
Okay. Okay.
There we go. Yeah. Bottom bullet point, poor prediction of risk. With adults, we have the static 99, the static 99R, and a couple of other genuinely actuarial instruments. And the risk prediction is so-so. It's better than chance, but it's around 60–70% accuracy. But even then, it doesn't predict the behavior of individuals. It only predicts the behavior of groups that they might belong to. When we look at all the factors listed on this slide, what we also need to remind ourselves is that none of these factors serve as sufficient predictors of future sexual aggression. Many abused kids grow up to be excellent people. They become social workers, probation officers, teachers, and as opposed to looking for any single factor, every sexually aggressive person has their own unique story. If there are risk factors that weight more heavily, and this is more true as the child is older and closer to adulthood, it's early exposure to sexual or physical abuse, probably physical abuse even more so than sexual abuse, early exposure to pornography or graphic sex as a participant or witness, or exposure to other sex offenders, family, or peers. Light change. It used to be more popular to think about all sex offenders were themselves sexually abused. Well, the research is pretty clear that that just is not the case at all. However, when you look at younger kids, it's probably true more often than not. And when you see a very young child, or 10 or 12 or even below, who is behaving in a sexually inappropriate manner, this may more accurately mimic or be part of a reenactment of a prior victimization or reflect behaviors that they've learned from witnessing sexual abuse. The age and gender of their victim may reflect their own victimization. And all things considered, the younger you see a child, a youth, the younger they are when you first see them for sexually inappropriate behavior, the higher the probability that he or she has themselves been sexually abused. When you get down below about age 12, there's a higher probability that this is the case. Oops, sorry. We've also examined the role of families in the generation of patterns of sexual offending, and it has been occasionally popular to say that families cause the sexual offending, that it's either parental deviance or poor bonding. But what we more likely see is just a general pattern of family dysfunction is one of the things that makes kids more vulnerable, because in these families, again, we come back to the issue of the people that we see who have problems of sexual aggression are folks who are disconnected or never connected to other people, don't bond, those kinds of things. I think the best approach to this is to think that there are multiple factors, and I think the research supports this, and it certainly is the case with treatment, that there are multiple pathways into offending this way, multiple pathways into sexually inappropriate and aggressive behavior. And the way I think about it with kids, and this is part of how kids are different than adults, is that there seems to be a developmental clock speed to sexuality, well, to a lot of things, but sexuality is our interest today, that there's a pace of becoming sexual, learning about sexuality, developing sexual relationships that should proceed at a gradual developmental level. As that first slide suggested, this normal sexual behavior of very young children is very mutual, exploratory. It's all about learning new things and enjoying that experience. When children are themselves abused, precociously exposed to sexuality, it pushes them forward on that developmental sequence past where they are in terms of brain capability, social capability, and it creates a real skewing of their experience and their knowledge about sexuality. And we see kids we call sexually reactive or sexually troubled. And this is always a surprise to me because this flies in the face of my own personal clinical biases. But attitudes and beliefs about women or sexual offending don't seem to be good predictors of sexual reoffense among juveniles. The family communication problems or poor parent-child attachment doesn't seem to be a good predictor. None of these things, although you will see them in the backgrounds of the youth with whom we work. Red flags. What are the things that most cogently warn us about an increased probability of sexual recidivism? And this takes us back over several slides, but a prior history of being abused in any way as a child, not just sexual abuse, but being physically abused, being, I would say, criminally neglected, but also not just as a victim, but as a witness to the abuse. One of the lessons that kids seem to come forward when they grow up in homes where there is an adult offender is that big people can do whatever they want to little people and get away with it. You see a wide age discrepancy between the perpetrator and their victim. Coercion, force, threats, or intimidation. Anything that's not that doesn't express the mutuality and the emotional connection that they would have with other people. An important consideration, and that we don't see so much with younger kids, but we begin to see it with the older juveniles, is an escalating pattern, or just a pattern, where you see multiple offenses and multiple victims, or multiple offenses with one victim over a period of time, and some evidence of, well, deviant sexual fantasies, but interest, hypersexualization, overinterested in sexuality, those kinds of things.
I'm sorry, because I skipped right to there.
Key points. There we go.
So if we can summarize, then some of the key points about recidivism, and one of the things that I think is really important here is to notice how we have been parsing our language, in that the idea of statistical prediction does not apply in the research parameters that we have right now, that we cannot speak with a degree of certainty in the way that we can around, for instance, violent juvenile offenders or general delinquency, where we have much more research and quite frankly, tighter tests of the accuracy of the research. But juveniles tend to be less likely to sexually reoffend than adult offenders, less likely to reoffend on any offenses than juveniles who commit delinquent offenses. They are more likely to recidivate with a non-sexual offense than a sex crime. They tend not to continue sexual offending into adulthood, that there's no single factor that explains recidivism. And you heard Dr. Wolf talk about the individual. So the factors are almost crafted in an individual kind of way. We may learn more about this, but there is no single factor, and multiple factors seem to be the best to explain behaviors.
Okay, so to this kind of third group, we have younger kids who offend, older kids who offend, and then we get into sort of middle and older juveniles. Then, because this is an evolutionary process, the older the juvenile becomes, the more like their adult counterparts they appear. And we start to see clear evidence of deviant sexual arousal, that their behavior becomes much more obviously patterned. You also see, and you see this in very young kids, that they'll use sexuality to self-soothe. And you see this in kids who don't grow up to be sex offenders, children who in bed at night, in the cradle at night, will touch their genitals in a way that gives them pleasure and relaxes them. In this using sex to self-soothe is something that continues into adulthood, even for not normal persons. No one in the room listening to the sound of my voice, by the way. But everyone else out there uses sex to self-soothe, and it's a part of what can be considered normal behavior. So when I say that sexually aggressive children and youth use sex to self-soothe, I'm talking about something that in terms of frequency and intensity is much more extensive in their lives. And one of the problems with this for them is that if they associate this with fantasies of abusing, they're conditioning themselves to be sexually aroused and sexually responsive to sexually aggressive themes, which begins to create the congruence for it. Incidents of abuse follow a predictable pattern or routine. And again, this is juveniles who persist into adulthood, not all juveniles who are sexually inappropriate or aggressive. But that when you look at various instances, you begin to see patterns. They select the same kind of victim, they select the same kind of circumstances, the same day of the week, the same time of the week, probably related to adult supervision patterns. But the juveniles who seem to persist into adulthood also show a lower level of social competence. It is not unusual among adult offenders to see individuals in their 40s and 50s who have never had a truly intimate relationship, that they go from relationship to relationship and they last for a few months, a year, 2 years. On the static 99, one of the warning signs is the individual has not had a peer relationship that's lasted 2 years, or they've lived with a person for 2 years, which speaks to that low social competence. They also show higher rates of antisocial behavior. And remember, I keep stressing this is a sliding scale, so as the child becomes older, these things become more often true. High rates of antisocial behavior and high rates of impulsivity.
I want to remind you that Janelle is taking your questions and organizing them for us. I don't know, Janelle, if there are any significant questions at this point, or if you think we should move right into psychosexual evaluation.
There haven't been any questions posted yet, but I did remind everyone in the chat and in the question section to please post your questions there, and we'll be taking breaks periodically to answer the questions. So
Okay.
Maybe, yeah, if anyone posts them, I'll come back and let you know, but for right now, we can go ahead and move on.
Okay, so we invite your questions, and we will move into a presentation of psychosexual evaluations, and then take any question that relates to this first half of our presentation.
Okay, I'm one of those people that do not want to be told what to do. And I certainly don't want my government telling me what to do. Don't infer much beyond that, but that's just the way I am. Especially in my profession. I have advanced degrees, I have tons of training and experience. I don't think the government should tell me how to do a psychosexual evaluation. Until I read the criteria that you guys have established in Florida. And I thought, this is really good. This is an excellent covering of all the units of interest. They're strong, good, and we support that. Okay, so we're going to do this juvenile psychosexual assessment. What's the purpose of this? Well, the purpose is to build understanding of what the person did, the history of it. We're trying to identify risks for future behavior. We're trying to identify the child's strengths. What are the things we could build on? And what are the vulnerabilities of this child and maybe their family environment? We want to integrate this understanding of family strengths and vulnerabilities with the child's personality, characteristics, behavioral history, et cetera, as part of building that understanding. And so we've listed 6 kind of key units of attention to go into a psychosexual evaluation. Yeah. First of all, a psychosexual evaluation needs to tell the child's story. There was some interesting research done back in the 60s or 70s in Canada where they looked at, they compared the findings, the opinions of 3 groups of people in the presence of psychological and behavioral history. And these groups were just a random sample of normal Canadian citizens, a group of psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers, and then a group of school teachers. And they showed them the sample, and they asked the person to make a prediction of what was going to happen in this individual's future. The group that did the best job of predicting future behavior were English teachers. And that makes some, I mean, there's some face validity there. English teachers are people who read a lot of stories. They're used to thinking about the continuation of a story from some beginning point through some evolutionary developmental sequence to an outcome. The story that the psychosexual evaluation tells has to be logical. It has to describe the person's life course, their personality, all of that. And then it leads us to a logically connected set of conclusions and recommendations for treatment. Risk instruments are useful in screening to the degree that they give us more information that we need to explore through the course of the evaluation. Yeah.
And I want to just share with you that we were given some redacted psychosexual evaluations, and one of the things that appeared to be consistent throughout those evaluations is what we tried to get at the second bullet here, and that is a real understanding of what the treatment needs are, and then they seem to be somewhat slim in their description of why a particular intervention was selected, particularly around the selection of a residential setting versus a community setting. And we'll get at that a little later in our presentation, but I want to kind of note that for you, and we're going to almost have a drumbeat here about questions. That if a psychosexual comes back and there is not a clear story here where you can follow it in logical order and you understand what the treatment needs are, treatment course is that's identified, and that you understand why a particular recommendation is made, those are questions that you ought to be asking of whoever did the evaluation.
Okay. It creates a clear picture. For example, especially with younger offenders, who had the most power authority in the incident? And obviously the sexually aggressive youth will most often be the older or physically larger, show more sexual knowledge. Select vulnerable targets that are younger, smaller, weaker, intellectually impaired in some way. And the offender, the identified perpetrator, will more often than not show the developmental disruptions in intimacy, impulsivity, and lifestyle. And beware of outliers. It's not always the oldest or biggest kid who is the perpetrator. In group sexual assaults, it's often hard to identify the conductor, the one in charge. And I've often seen a kid who was at the periphery who, had he not been involved with this group, would probably never have acted out in this sexually aggressive way. And so unless he's back in that group, he's a low-risk offender. You know, assessment instruments in a lot of ways are the choice of the evaluator. Some of the risk assessment instruments, there are a few choices, so most people will use the same ones. But the IQ, personality profiles that are selected, you want that information, even though it doesn't tell you anything about their reoffense and probably very little about their sexual behavior. They support your decision making and help you with case management rather than any capacity to accurately produce risk. These instruments talk in gross patterns. They see big numbers. They don't see the individual, and they certainly don't see the attitudes and beliefs beneath the behavior.
One of the pieces that came up on preparation that we wanted to address rather directly is the relationship of the PACT's information to the kinds of assessment instruments that may be being used in your psychosexual evaluations. And the graphic here is really intended to communicate some of the issues that are related to trying to estimate risk of sexual reoffense. That your PACT is going to continue to be a strong, and I mean it, having worked with you all for the better part of 5 years, is that the PACT is one of the best instruments in the country with respect to an actuarial instrument for classification of delinquent youth and prediction of recidivism of the population that you have. However, in terms of predicting reoffense rates with sexual offenders or juveniles with sex crimes, there are a couple of things that we've talked about before that would factor into any discussion that you would have about using the PACT as the instrument by which to predict recidivism. And one is that the PACT is heavily weighted in its actuarial system towards criminal history, anti-sexual peers, number of prior offenses, age at first offense, substance abuse rates, and the like. And so many of the kids that come in, as we saw from the data that was presented on Florida, are younger offenders, but they also have less criminal history, fewer antisocial peers, and lower rates of substance abuse. The other piece to think about is the number of kids that come in on sex offenses. And many of the instruments that we're talking about, if you use them as a classification system for risk, one of the pitfalls here is that the rate of reoffense is so low that you really don't get any discrimination between high, moderate, high, low, moderate risk offenders. And that it may seem like a sort of a nuanced point, and it is, but what you expect and what the PACT does is create a classification system where the amount of difference in reoffense rate is over 10% for each one of the categories. Well, with an average reoffense rate of 7%, you're not going to have that kind of differentiation. So I expect you to have some questions about this, but what we really want to do is to have you thinking in your head that the PACT is going to give you good predictive information about general delinquent behavior, and that some of the instruments that are used in the psychosexual evaluation are generally useful in terms of estimating sexual reoffense. But that estimate really occurs, as we've been talking about, in the context of using these instruments to guide interviews and to assess in the context of a more comprehensive pieces of information. The major instruments, or three common instruments that are found nationwide and that you may see, are the JSOAP, and the second version of it is the version that is in play right now, and that is the Juvenile Sex Offender Assessment Protocol. And I think it's really, you almost want to circle that word protocol, because it really does work towards an interview protocol. It has 4 subscales within it. One is sex drive and preoccupation, and that is a static or a static variable, impulse and antisocial behavior, and then the response to interventions and community stability and adjustment, which are both dynamic factors. So it is an assessment protocol along with a clinical interview. The second, and we are told that this is the most common that is used across Florida, is the eraser. And that is the estimate of risk of adolescent sexual offense recidivism. And again, they're making a clear distinction between sex offense recidivism and general recidivism for delinquent behavior. It uses 5 broad factors: sex interest and attitudes, historical sexual assaults, psychosexual functioning, family environment, and then response to treatment. And one of the real benefits of the eraser is that it asks questions about in the last 6 months. So it's particularly useful in terms of using it in a test, retest kind of protocol, so that at the various stages of your case management, as you are developing your comprehensive evaluation, as a kid is moving through residential services, through considerations of discharge, back into the community and community adjustment, and then termination of services. These would all be times when the eraser would give you, for this particular youth, some trend line in terms of how they are moving with respect to these factors. The final that is used is the JSORIT, and that is very much intended to be an instrument that is risk predictive. It has 12 factors or items within it, and the rating is related to the offense or the history of offense that is in the record. So it's a record review, and frankly, for all of these instruments themselves, their predictive value is really very limited. The JSOP will tell you that it is not an actuarial instrument in any way. The JSORIT attempts to be an actuarial instrument, but has not tested out. It's why the information that's being developed by Florida and the 4 other states in the Urban Institute study is going to be so valuable to us. Nonetheless, these instruments have value in terms of the planning for treatment and supervision as you move through the process with with planning, treatment, and your supervision.
Okay, so you've had a kid referred, you have a copy of the psychosexual evaluation, you've read the report. For our purposes, let's say it's a good report. Let's say that it tells a good story about the kid's development and the nature of the behavior of interest, that they've done a good job of connecting all those things to their findings and recommendations. What do you do with it? Well, at the end of the document, in the findings and recommendations, they should, and you should be able to tease out easily the focus and the elements of treatment. What are the high-risk areas that need to be addressed? And it guides both yourself and the treatment provider in responding to significant changes as from residential to community. It guides release decision-making, and it's useful in evaluating progress or lack of progress. The recommendations should be specific, and the author should justify them. They should reference the areas in the report that speak to the problems for which the recommendations are intended. What is the focus of treatment? with kids especially, how will the family be involved? There should be a section in the evaluation that talks specifically about the evaluator's contacts with and conversations with the family and his or her opinions and observations about the family. Is community-based treatment recommended? If not, why was it ruled out? Is the recommendation for residential supported? And what is the estimated duration of treatment, and what's the justification? And like the broken record, we come back to it. Ask questions of the evaluator, ask questions of the records, ask questions of the treatment provider, all those kinds of things. Now,
before we go on, Janelle, do we have questions?
oh, sorry.
I just want to keep in mind the time, though. There is only 30 minutes left in the webinar, but there are 3 questions, so I'll go ahead and ask them really fast. The first one is, in reference to intake status, the PCA received are charging any 16-year-old child having sex with a 14-year-old are being charged with lewd and lascivious battery. When the act is mutual, consensual, do the DJJ SAR reflect a non-file or to proceed as filing with the court? Do we know?
And I'm going to flip that question back in that I think there are some considerations that Florida DJJ and guidance that Florida DJJ may be able to give you with respect to that. We know that these charging patterns are really being heavily influenced by things like Adam Walsh and the sexual offender registry requirements and your code in particular, but we did not take that on for this particular webinar. We imagine that there might be some feedback or information to the field that will come following this webinar, so I very much appreciate the question.
Okay, and then 2 questions from the same person. What is the age of the youngest youth that can be labeled as a sexual offender in Florida?
And again, that's a Florida code specific question, and
right.
Yeah,
that should be. That I'm wondering if that's posted in the handout in the code.
Yeah.
The code handout book that was offered. Another question that's probably specific too is if a youth is labeled as a sex offender, does that mean that they are also labeled as a sex offender as an adult?
And again, let's put those questions as frequently asked questions that maybe DJJ might answer.
Okay.
In terms of your requirements with respect to code.
Okay, last question.
If I'm not mistaken, the requirements are 25 years on the registry.
Okay.
But there may be some opportunity for petition related to that.
Right. And the last question, when a youth is charged with a sexual charge, when is the best point in time to refer the youth for a psychosexual? Right away, right?
Exactly. The sooner the better.
Right. Okay. All right. That's the last one for now.
Okay. So moving on in terms of this continuum of treatment between community-based treatment and residential treatment, we thought it was really important to begin to kind of parse this in terms of what the targets are of treatment programs. And we found this very interesting slide about treatment targets, and the dark lines here are what kinds of services were reported as available as treatment targets in community settings and what were available in residential. And I think some of the piece related to this is really that there's very little difference between what program treatment targets are based on settings, so that there are other considerations that are in play related to treatment settings. And this is just a context in terms of intervention types that should be familiar to you. The one that we really want to kind of note up is that individual therapy is not recommended as a sole treatment intervention, and we appreciate that in some areas having group interventions or specific interventions that are family-oriented are a challenge. But some of the disadvantages are both in terms of the ability of therapists to kind of keep their balance and their boundaries, and how manipulative these kids can be, that denial can be sustained, and that there's a lack of opportunity to learn from other offenders, as might be the case in group settings.
If you're going to use individual therapy, my bias is it's best used as an adjunct to group therapy. It's also better with younger kids who are more developmentally more prepared to relate to one person as opposed to a group of peers, whereas older kids are much more peer focused, much more comfortable in a peer environment.
And in family therapy, we really wanted to notice for you that there are really two areas where family therapy can be particularly useful. And one, of course, is the resolution of identified dysfunctions within the family and family behaviors. But the second is really building parental capacity to monitor the behavior of these kids when they are living in their homes, and that supervision and monitoring and the parental support in terms of compliance to the conditions are particularly important in terms of predicting outcomes with these kids. This slide is about treated versus non-treated youth in community programs. And what's interesting here to me is that it is really no different than any other delinquent population that we've encountered, that when kids are left untreated, their rates are generally about double what they would be if they were treated. And the treatment types for juvenile sex offenders and sex offender specific treatments include cognitive behavioral interventions and other interventions that would be familiar to you in your practice.
Okay, residential care is typically recommended when there's a higher risk to public safety or to victim safety, or when you lack the appropriate community resources, or when you have a family who appears not ready to provide the sort of supervision and support the juvenile will need to remain offense-free. These are ideally residential is used with people who have more severe emotional and behavioral problems. They have poor motivation for treatment. They've previously been unsuccessful in community-based treatment. And the victim is present in the juvenile's home. Reasons for over-reliance on residential care. Sometimes there's a negative community sentiment around a particular child, and it may be safer to keep the kid in residential care than to send them back to the community. Again, lack of confidence in existing community resources, or the presence of no resources in the community. Limited specialized management capacity, and just insufficient data on the individual.
This is from your CARS report in terms of residential programs and the lengths of stay. Nationwide, lengths of stay for youth in residential programs has really come under a great deal of scrutiny, and juvenile sex offender programs have been particularly highlighted for their long lengths of stay. And certainly you see long lengths of stay here in these programs in Florida. And we also noted that the recidivism rates that were reported for these programs, we don't have a way of knowing what of that recidivism is sex crimes recidivism and what of it is just general delinquency recidivisms. But those numbers are, in fact, high in comparison to what we've seen nationwide.
Okay, discharge criteria. This, you refer back to the original psychosexual evaluation and you try to remember what the child looked like when they came into care, came under supervision, and you look for improvements in their capacity to understand the impact of their behavior on others, some evidence of an ability to connect with other people in a more emotionally intimate manner, demonstrate ability to seek help when it's needed, and multiple indications that the individual is able to manage both their sexual behavior but also possibly their antisocial behavior, that they have a sense of their own offense cycle, chain or pattern, whatever you want to call it, and that the treatment provider working with the JPO and other people has prepared and the family has written a transition plan for treatment in the community that keeps the community potential or existing victims safe. It has to be doable. I mean, it's fine to recommend all this treatment, but then the kid is going back into the community where there are no resources. Oh, and workbooks are not treatment. I've consulted to programs where I've sat down with them to look at a kid's progress through treatment, and the progress is that they've completed all 5 workbooks that are necessary. In one case, I asked for the workbooks. The staff had clearly never looked in the workbooks because when I opened it, what I found was page after page of the child's writing that said, you guys are stupid, you guys are foul language, I can't wait to get out of here. If I see you on the street, I'll run you down. Workbooks are not treatment. They have a purpose to serve, but they are not of and by themselves treatment.
And the final piece on this slide is really that there is housing and family residence readiness and other supports in place. And it really speaks to the kind of work that needs to be done in the community and with the family during the time that a child is in a residential placement. That getting the family ready, if the victim is in the home or a related victim, the extent to which there has been treatment of that victim and readiness of the family to supervise and manage the juvenile is a critical variable to consider in terms of discharge criteria.
We've kind of mixed 2 concepts here. Is disclosure important? Is owning the behavior important? The research certainly on older offenders is mixed. There's some research that suggests that admitting to the behavior is of limited importance to successful treatment. But the important piece here is the victim apology letters as a benefit to treatment and considerations for the victim. The victim's well-being is always first. The therapist should develop an apology letter with the sexually aggressive juvenile, and this is a good place for individual attention, individual therapy. It should be developed over time. It's a therapeutic activity in its own right, and it should always be shared with the victim's therapist first. If the victim has no therapist, it should not be shared with the victim, because we don't know what kind of secret code the aggressive youth might have included in the letter to warn his victim to keep their mouth shut, etc. And this whole process should be guided by the victim's therapist.
In our preparation, we had a significant discussion about victim apology letters and the way that they are written into court orders with a requirement that they be done within 30 days. This may not be a realistic opportunity with respect to having any impact in terms or benefit either for the offender or the victim. And so as you consider where the victim is with respect to their ability to take accountability for their behaviors, you would consider the apology letter within that. And that an attempt at an apology letter early in treatment is certainly something that a treatment provider or clinician may in fact do, and then use repeated efforts at an apology letter as part of the clinical regime. But we would hope that you could build some discretion into your court orders as to when a victim letter would be required by the court.
I actually use.
Sure.
Should we pause for some questions?
Sure.
Okay. So I think this one may have been answered. It may have been posted after you discussed this, but someone was asking, when using the PACT to assess the level of risk to reoffend for a youth with a charge of sexual in nature, how accurate is the PACT? I have come across a huge gap in the assessment recommendation and the PACT result. Is the PACT set up for sex charges to work effectively?
Okay, and I think we have answered that for you,
Yeah.
that it is not a specific question. And one of the resource materials that we gave you has a chapter within it that is on assessment of sex offenders, and I would particularly recommend that to you, that you really study up on the difference there.
Okay. Someone was asking about how we pair therapy so that it's most beneficial for the youth, and by we she means juvenile probation officers and the court and sexual offender therapists, to meet the needs of mental health, substance abuse, family environment, past trauma.
Okay, that's the question?
Yeah.
And how you pair therapy, is that the word you're using?
Yeah, she said, how do you suggest that we pair therapy so that it is most beneficial for the youth?
I think you, as a treatment team, including the probation officer and any other players on that team, look at the needs and triage what's most important, what's most critical to management and safety, and with your knowledge of the youth, and attack those first. If the person is actively abusing substances, of course, that's a critical place to start, because you need to get the substance out of the system before you can do psychotherapy, those kinds of things. I think you start with family therapy pretty quickly. Actually, during the evaluation, you're making contact with the family, forming alliances, doing whatever you can or need to do to form an alliance with them so you have their support. You may only touch base with them periodically for a period of time, but as you get closer to the end, then you're going to gear up that family therapy, so you're helping them learn what they need to do to manage the kids' risks and vulnerabilities in the community.
Great. And then I think you talk about this in this last section of the presentation of the webinar, but someone asked how important are polygraph exams as part of the treatment process?
Polly, that's a tough question. There is no national or international data that really speaks to the ethics and the effectiveness of polygraph with children. And I'm not sure if a floor age has been established below which you polygraph. I don't think so. The answer to that question is a local jurisdictional question. Whatever your community's safe with, I would always, always, always be cautious. The ethics of using polygraphs, especially with children, meaning under 18, is that they're not free to make that decision. They're, they are minors. They're considered not able to make that decision. So you need to involve legal representatives and whomever else, family, et cetera, in making those decisions.
Another piece of this is the accuracy of polygraphs with young offenders, and there, as Steve mentioned, there's quite a lot of dispute in the literature about how accurate the polygraph testing is itself in a standalone kind of way with juveniles. At least some of this really has to do with that question about disclosure and accountability, and the extent to which those methods might be used in the treatment process versus how you use it in the context of community supervision.
I'm really comfortable with it with older kids like that are 17 or 18, and I'm certainly very, very comfortable with it with adults, and I understand the limitations of the polygraph. It's useful to me as a clinician with older adolescents and adults as a fishing expedition. I get a lot more information out of them before the polygraph than I actually get from the actual polygraph. But it depends, again, on local standards, what the community's comfortable with.
Okay, there's two more questions. I'm just looking at the time, though, so I'll ask them quickly. One was, do the youth in Florida stay in residential longer than the national average?
I'm sad to say we don't have national data.
Okay, someone here in headquarters is shaking his head yes. So there's your answer, Kimberly. All right. The last question is, when a youth is on intake and not willing to participate in a psychosexual, what resources are there? Recourse, I'm sorry. Is there as another means to assess risk before they are placed on probation and the department's jurisdiction?
I would say, this is Jeannie, I would say we don't. We've run into this both with the PACT as well. If they have been advised not to participate prior to adjudication, there's really nothing we can do. That would be my answer.
All right, so we should go ahead and continue then.
Yeah, and let's move into community supervision. And the first piece that applies both to community supervision and residential is that you really want to form a treatment team. And that treatment team should involve the therapist and juvenile probation officer and other community stakeholders, really formulating a treatment plan and a process of supervision that's going to take place. If it's residential providers, those therapists will be in the residential setting. If you are dealing with a kid that's coming out of residential, you may want to create some way in which those linkages take place. But also in this slide, we've included parents and caretakers as well as the youth themselves. That very often the parents and caretakers are excluded from the discussion about the treatment plan. You know, I might kind of note for you that one of the webinars that we have coming up will be on family engagement, but the family's buy-in and the family's ability to be an adjunct, if not a leader, in the supervision of these children and the assurance that they comply is critical to outcomes. And the youth themselves are generally old enough to participate in the treatment plan in some meaningful way and in the treatment team, and has valuable information to give you with respect to how well it's working. This is just a visual model to communicate to you about the process, in that the gray and black and white area really describes DJJ's formal involvement with a child, and the blue is the larger piece of community. And we could have spread them out in a different kind of way. But these first several blocks are intended to really begin to describe the treatment services and the intervention services that happen for families. And we think that community supervision by a juvenile probation officer ought to take place as treatment is winding down and beyond. For that, much of the research suggests that that the stabilization of kids post-treatment is a very important treatment goal to keep in mind with respect to the function of community supervision by juvenile probation officers. And the elements of the juvenile probation officer role are really standard with respect to the kinds of things that already occur within your job descriptions. That these are really not different elements, but I think the intensity of the elements can be quite different. In terms of understanding the psychosexual evaluation results, that's a critical piece. And knowing and being able to orient families to what the results of these evaluations are, and then what the expectations would be coming out of this, and the ability and the time that it takes to collaborate with treatment providers and a supervision, crafting a supervision plan is quite important. As we talk about a supervision plan, some questions have arisen about our being really more specific with you about what some of the elements or conditions are that might be included in a supervision plan, and we've listed quite a few of these here for you.
Okay.
We advise that there be early involvement in families for the reasons that we've already talked about. Some of the skill set that you have in motivational interviewing will help you find common ground with families and help you begin to work with them in that they may have as much denial and resistance as the juveniles themselves. And this next feature is about making family involvement an expectation rather than an option. And I am in favor of court orders really specifying family involvement as part of the court order so that it's understood that that's a requirement. And getting the family's input with respect to case planning and safety plans and relapse prevention planning is similarly an important focus to have, in that their buy-in will be quite critical. I want to move into some of the challenges with respect to involving parents.
Yeah, families with children who are sexually acting out, sexually offending, sexually aggressive. This really talks to something profoundly basic and frightening in most families. Fear of revealing family secrets, that first of all, they have an offender in their family, or there may be another undisclosed offender in their family that needs to remain a secret. They want to naturally minimize or deny the problem, deny the incident, blame the victim. There's the push and pull of protecting the victim and the offender, and feeling like they have to choose between one child over another. There's the intrusion into the daily living practices of the home that's involved in supervising a sexually aggressive youth, and just feeling overwhelmed by the system, feeling like they've lost control to the probation officer, to the social worker, to the therapist. And issues of cultural competency. We live in a very diverse world in this country now, and we see families from other cultures and other social and family practices, and it's up to us to understand them more than they understand us.
We see home visits as being a critical element of your work as a probation officer with these families to really review safety plans and observe them in action and really be able to support and coach, model, and mentor and educate families. That this role is one well worth discussing with treatment providers about who will do this work and how it will be done and how you will respond to it. We wanted to really talk in more detail than our time is going to permit because we didn't manage it well, and that is about non-compliant behavior. And when you move to the point of having and addressing incidences, our advice is that you address them early and often, that you avoid the language of violation as much as you can, that you do this in consultation with the treatment team, and that you really weigh the treatment versus sanction benefit in terms of how you respond to a violation. That you have some resources in terms of increasing the amount and frequency of treatment as part of your progressive response. We also would suggest to you that using electronic monitoring may be, an opportunity or an alternative to using removal from the home or removal from treatment. I think a lot about specialized mentors, both for the families and the kids themselves, and really initiating and increasing the intensity of both treatment and supervision in the face of these events. We know that these are kids that will test the boundaries, so these incidences really need to be anticipated and understood in the context of the kinds of behaviors that they may engage in, but also in the context of public safety. And so some of the critical factors to weigh.
Let's not forget that alleged and so-called normal kids test boundaries. That's part of being a juvenile. So when we see it in a sexually aggressive kid, it's not anything particularly special. It's part and parcel of being a child. The stakes are higher, perhaps, but we shouldn't see that as a criminogenic behavior. Other critical factors to weigh are the seriousness of the behavior. If it looks like it's part of a return to their pattern of sex offending, like they are a child molester, or they have molested children rather, and they are now putting themselves in environments where kids are there and kids are available, that's a serious consideration. The degree to which community safety is jeopardized, meaning if there is a reoffense, what is the harm going to be both to a new victim and to the community? Level of responsibility assumed by the youth for this if they're caught doing something that's counter-therapeutic or sanctioned by their conditional release plan or their safety plan. Do they own it, or do they drop back into their original denial? I would see the denial as part of their pattern. the responses of parents and caregivers to it. They take it seriously. The capacity of caregivers to provide structure and support in the presence of this new concern, and the presence of other assets or services in the community to assist and help motivate and maintain juvenile compliance.
We're going to stop with our presentation there. We know that our time has really elapsed. We're a few minutes over time. We are happy to stay on the webinar and continue to answer questions. There are 170 of you that are still with us, and I think that's a remarkable thing for a Friday afternoon. I thank you all for your participation. As people indicated, there is information that will be on your K drive to support this presentation, and hopefully we'll be adding to it as time goes on. I'm also told that within an hour of the close of this webinar, you'll receive a Survey Monkey or a evaluation to complete. In particular, we're very interested in what other training related to problem sexual behaviors you might desire, or more elaborate training, as well as your feedback with respect to this. So with that, I'm going to turn to Janelle again for questions, and we'll just continue forward. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you, Marion. Everyone who's on this webinar, as soon as you close it, there will be a link to the survey. If you're one of those people that are watching it in a group, I already sent you out an email, and that is a separate survey. It's the Survey Monkey, but everyone who is currently signed in on the webinar will receive the link to complete the survey as soon as you exit. So we do have a couple questions for those of you that want to remain on. This question is, if a youth receives sex offender treatment in a residential setting, approximately how long should they continue counseling post-commitment?
There is no research supported period of time. I look at the kid's progress in treatment in residential, how he's doing in the community, what his compliance, his ability to self-manage is, and there's also just the issue of overlearning. I think it is clinically and managerially useful for some authority to stay in touch with a kid for a pretty long period of time. He may not be in active treatment after some period of time, but that he knows that somebody's looking over his shoulder to help support him. 6 months of treatment post-release is a good estimate of time, but I would say post-treatment maintenance is important.
Okay, great. And then this other person who asked the question shows that they've left, but I'll ask the question anyway. If a youth is released from a residential program and the victim resides in the home, what would be your recommendations? Should the youth return home or be placed somewhere else?
And I think that's going to come to a case-by-case assessment. Hopefully you have got your child protective services involved in this, or family preservation services involved in this, as well as a victim therapist. And that collaboration with the victim therapist about where the victim is in terms of their recovery, where the family is in terms of their circumstance and their ability to monitor and supervise the child. I mean, some of these conditions have to do with the ability to provide these kids with separate lodging and others. Some of the services that can be available would be therapeutic foster homes and other kinds of step-down residential settings for these youth. I know many group homes are reluctant with respect to moving a child from a residential sex offender program into a group home. And I think these are the kinds of things that your local sex abuse networks, if you have them in place, ought to be discussing in terms of what the step-down opportunities are, what the residential alternatives are within the community if out-of-home placement is required. The other is to really think about some of the clinical services that can intervene here. In particular, an intensive MST style program that is, or other kinds of home-based interventions that are really looking at the youth within the home and the family within the home, and really coaching and working with the parents with respect to their supervision of the children. And MST should have an opportunity for augmenting parental supervision on a very intensive basis for the early release piece of this. I think the other piece is to really have some plans in place that if placement in the home is not working, then what contingency plan do you have other than return to a residential setting for this particular individual? But as I say, that relationship with the victim therapist and anyone from Child Protective Services that is intervening with this child would be critical factors in terms of weighing the best interests of the victim as well as the offender and the family.
Okay, great. Those are the last questions. There were just a couple comments. I loved the webinar. I would like to attend future webinars on this topic. I handle sex offenders for my unit. And then another comment, thanks for all your expertise. So I believe
that's a good way to end a Friday. We were so pleased with the number of people that signed up for this. It far exceeded our expectations in terms of how many people would make time to do this, and it may argue for additional kinds of webinars like this.
Well, Marian and Dr. Wolf, we just wanted to thank you so much on behalf of the DJJ for all your expertise, and we really, really appreciate it. I will be getting all these resources out to everyone, and please complete the survey upon exiting the webinar.
And thank you for the opportunity.
No problem. All right, bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.